All right, welcome. This is AllMinucOne, and my name is Bill. Today, we're going to try and keep it brief. I'm going to read a short excerpt from The Vampire Economy. This is in the preface. This book may be helpful as an answer to those burning questions. Why did Hitler start another war? How did it become possible that the Fuhrer could lead millions of intelligent and cultured people who hate senseless slaughter into a war which must have devastating effects upon Germany as well as the whole of mankind? We cannot be satisfied with the answer that Hitler is a madman and that the German people are fools and slaves willing to go to war to satisfy a madman's dreams. Most people in Germany are like people in other countries, hardworking and decent, with human qualities as good and as bad as those of other people throughout the world. But a system has been built up which has enabled one man to decide about war and peace. A system which held and still holds a whole nation in its iron grip and does not allow any individual German to escape the inherent facilities of its regime. The fatalism, which was typical of the spirit of the German businessmen before Europe was plunged into this war, was not due to economic difficulties alone, but far more to feeling that he must become part of a machine, inexorably leading him to a disaster. German businessmen once believed that the Fuhrer would lead them into a world of happiness and prosperity. They were willing to accept the first measures of regimentation as necessary but temporary emergency acts, though, or they thought of the raids against the Jews and the sadistic brutalities of the brown shirts as an excuse of uncontrollable elements which should disappear. These hopes had vanished before the start of the war. Those who hated bureaucracy and the regimentation that had compelled to participate in the construction of a system which could end only in war and destruction. They had been made part of a monster machine steered by the Fuhrer, who was responsible to nobody. This totalitarian Frankenstein could not exist peacefully. It could not transform armaments production into production of consumption goods, thus ending the war scare and creating another era of prosperity. Nor could it wait for the peaceful exploitation of new conquest, which, as a matter of fact, were not sufficient to correct the shortage of basic raw materials. Any attempt to create a new era of peace would have precipitated the major crisis economically and politically for the totalitarian regime, and this would have meant the end of all far-reaching imperialist plans. Sacrifices and investments made in preparation for imperialist expansion and for world rule have been in vain. The gradual decay of the totalitarian regime would have been inevitably had the Fuhrer chosen peace instead of war. History is revengeful. Dictators are also dictated by the necessities of their own regime. This is a quote that he quotes: "The logic of the machine crushes the constructor and turns him into its slave," says Emil Ludwig. And that was Gunter Riemann of The Vampire Economy, Doing Business Under Fascism, written in 1939. Now note he talks about the brown shirts, expecting them to go away. The brown shirts will not go away. We have Antifa right now. They are essentially the same thing. They're just communists. These regimes that they say that they are going to, or these plans they say they're going to implement, are not going to be any better than anything that we have now. But what we do have now is a constitution that is largely ignored. And the government has precipitated this by creating its own machine. This own machine that people have, over the course of history, especially the last 100 years, have bought into. This machine that we allow the government to dictate our liberties instead of we dictate what the government is allowed to do. We've allowed certain factions to take over. And with that, I want to read excerpts from George Washington's farewell address. Now, as always, I will link these sources in the description. So, let's begin here. The unity of government, which constitutes you one people, is also now dear to you. It is justly so, for it is the main pillar and the edifice of your real independence, the support of your tranquility at home, your peace abroad, of your safety, of your prosperity, of that very liberty which you so highly prize. But as it is easy to foresee that, from different causes and from different quarters, much pains will be taken, many artifices employed to weaken in your minds the conviction of this truth. As this is the point in your political fortress against which the batteries of eternal and external enemies will be almost consistently and actively, though often covertly and insidiously, direct, watching for its preservation with jealous anxiety. Discontinuance, whatever may suggest even a suspicion that it can, in any event, be abandoned, and indignantly frowned upon, the first drawing of every attempt to alienate any portion of the country from the rest, or to enfeeble the sacred ties which now link together the various parts. For this you have every inducement of sympathy and interest. Washington is talking about exactly what has happened. This was his farewell address when he left the White House. He mentioned several things that were very important that we have completely ignored, that I'm not going to address in here, but I will again at another time. But he is talking about the fracturing of America and how it would happen. And it is always through special interest and political parties, and people that do not care about you. They only care about their own power. And without the individual, without each and every person in the under the control of the government, every citizen standing up for their liberty, your liberties are then lost. Continuing, the name of American, which belongs to you in your national capacity, must always exalt the just pride of patriotism more than any appellation derived from local discriminations. He's talking about the need for patriotism. I know that's, to some crazy people, an ugly word today, but it is not. Freedom, the greatest government ever created here in the United States, is slowly eroding. With slight shades of difference, you have the same religion, manners, habits, and political principles. You have in common cause, fought, and triumphed together. The independence and liberty you possess are the work of joint councils and the joint efforts of common dangers, suffering, and successes. But these considerations, however powerful they address themselves to your sensibility, are greatly outweighed by those which apply more immediately to your interest. Hence, likewise, they will avoid the necessity of those overgrown military establishments which, under any form of government, are inauspicious to liberty and which are to be regarded as practically hostile to a republican liberty. Now, we were never intended to have a standing army, ever. The Constitution was written and founded, the Americas, under the Articles of Confederation before that, was only set to basically muster an army if there was an attacking force, but mostly primarily to build militias, and that every man was to be ready to be part of that militia when called. People were left to their own self-defense. There may have been sheriffs that counties would hire, but it is not the same thing as a large police force or a standing military. Our standing military was created under Jefferson to fight the Barbary pirates, to keep Americans from being enslaved by those Barbary pirates who were trying to ship goods, and has never gone away since. All right. In this sense, it is that you and your union ought to be considered as a main prop of your liberty, and that the love of the one ought to endear you to the preservation of the other, while experience shall not have demonstrated its impracticability. There will always be reason to distrust the patriotism of those who, in any quarter, may endeavor to weaken its bonds. And I believe when he means quarter, he's talking about election time. The contemplating in contemplating the cause which may disrupt our union, it occurs as matter of serious concern that any ground should have been furnished for characterizing parties by geographical discrimination, north and south, Atlantic and west, whence designing men may endeavor to excite a belief that there is a real difference of local interest and views. Now, he's talking about on a national level, because the national government isn't meant to govern locally. It is meant to protect us from outsiders. It's meant to deal with foreign relations primarily, and to ensure that the relations between the states become or remain kosher, that everything is well and good. It is not meant to do about 95% of the stuff that it does today. One of the expedients of the party to acquire influence within particular districts is to misrepresent the opinions and aims of other districts. Does this sound familiar? You should not, or you cannot shield yourself too much against the jealousness and heart burnings which spring from these misrepresentations, meaning guard your emotions, people. They tend to render alien to each other those who ought to be bound together by fraternal affection. All obstructions to the execution of the law, all combinations and associations under whatever plausible character, with the real design to direct, control, and counteract. The real design, right? Or all the regular deliberation and action of the constituted authorities are destructive of this fundamental principle and of fatal tendency. They serve to organize faction, to give it to artificial and extraordinary force, to put in the place of the delegated will of the nation the will of the party. Often a small but artful and enterprising minority of the community, and according to the alternative triumphs of different parties, to make the public administration the mirror of the ill-concerted and incongruous projects of faction, rather than the organ of the consent and wholesome plans designed by common councils and modified by mutual interest. However, combinations or associations of the above description may now and then answer popular ends. They are likely, in the course of time and things, to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reign of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which have lifted them which have lifted them to unjust dominion. What have I been saying? What is every single video I stated has been about? Intelligent, wise men, well-educated men, men of reason and caution will always be prophets. They will always be prophets in the end because they understand the course of history and human nature, and it does not change. The heart of a man does not change. The heart of human beings is always the same, and the pull to power and control is great. And so in order to provide for the maximum liberty, the maximum prosperity for everyone, we need to stand up against such things. Towards the preservation of your government and the permanency of your present happy state, it is requisite not only that you steadily discountenance irregular opposition to its acknowledged authority, but also that you resist with care the spirit of innovation upon its principles, however specious the pretext, meaning Be careful of change for the sake of change. One of the worst things the United States ever did was take away the Senate from the states and gave it to the people. That alone took power away from the states, and that alone took power away from the guardian level of government, or a guardian level of government, an intermediary level. Another thing that they did was essentially they made the president the head figure of the United States. And the president is not supposed to be your representative. Congress is. The president is supposed to deal with matters of foreign affairs. One method of assault may be to effect in the forms of the Constitution alterations, which will impair the energy of the system, and thus to undermine what cannot be directly overthrown. I mean, that's everything that we do now. We don't listen to the Constitution. We haven't declared a constitutional war since the Second World War. We literally, the Congress defers its right and its constitutional right and power to vote for war, so they do not have to get the blame, and they can point their finger at the president. And it's completely wrong. The system was there for a reason. Most Congress people don't even listen to their people. There's a study from Princeton or Yale some years ago that said, I don't recall off the top of my head, but something like 70% of the actions Congress take are not issues relevant to, or issues that people want. But let's get back here to this text. I have already intimated to you the dangers of the parties in the state, with particular reference to the founding of them on geographical discriminations. Let me now take a more comprehensive view and warn you in the most solemn manner against the baneful effects of the spirit of party generally. This spirit, unfortunately, is inseparable from our nature, having its roots in the strongest passions of the human mind. That would be tribalism, people. You versus me, or us versus them, you versus me, black versus white. It's not in the spirit of openness. It exists under different shapes in all governments, more or less stifled, controlled, or repressed, but in those of the popular form, it is seen in the greatest rankness and is truly their worst enemy. Now, remember when I read John Adams, his letter to John Taylor, he talked about democracy and how it always commits suicide historically. That's what party systems end up doing. The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissensions, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities, is itself frightful despotism. But this leads at length to the more formal and permanent despotism. So the false construct that we have is left versus right in this country, and really it's center right versus center left, and they basically are both moving up along the same lines, and it's the fractions within the party. Now the right, the Republicans, they have been largely fractured most of the time. And the reason why is because generally people who go with the Republican Party are more individualistic. The people on the left are more collectivistic, and therefore they continually shift left. And there have been studies on this. A lot of times when we talk about politics, they try to put it, people try to put it in a European framework. Well, European framework is not the American context at all. Liberty is minarchism. It's small government, limited control, almost to the point of anarchy, but just enough to keep us away from anarchy. And on the other side is full-on despotism or tyranny. Collectivism is always despotism and tyranny. Fascism is a collectivist idea. It is not right-wing. Is it right of communism? Yes. Is it right of constitutionalism, American constitutionalism, liberty? No. It is so far removed from that. It is the government centralizing its power, asking to take care of you, and you to actually be a cog within the wheels of the government. And I could prove this to you by simply reading the doctrines of fascism. And by the way, I've said this before and I will say it again, fascism has nothing to do with racism. Racism was an element of fascism within Nazi Germany. It was not per se in Italy nor in Spain. And I can tell you now that even though they're called communists, the Chinese government now is more fascist, more close to what a fascist government is than a communist government. Now, there are racial elements that the Chinese have within their government. They don't like Muslims. They don't like black people. They have certain things. There are various different Chinese ethnic groups. It's the Hans that run things. The other ethnic groups they do not like. Back to the text. But this leads to links to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and the miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose on the absolute power of the individual. And sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purpose of his own elevation on the reins of public liberty. How do you not know this? Why isn't this taught in school? Why do people think differently? It's because they're listening to their egos. They're listening to the outer world. They're not thinking. They're being shallow. And they want to believe in stupid, ridiculous, fantastical, utopian niceties. Well, I can tell you in the end, what happens is everyone becomes poor except for those in the political class. It serves always to distract the public councils and enfeebles the public administration. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms. Does this sound familiar? Kindles the animosities of one part against another. Foments occasionally riot and insurrection. What is going on today, people? Think. It opens the doors to foreign influence and corruption. That would be the Council of Foreign Relations, wanting to have a one world government. That would be being in the UN. That would be the WHO, and maybe you want that big global government because you think that's going to bring peace on earth. It's not. It's just going to bring despotism, which finds a facilitated access to the government itself through the channels of party passions. I'm a lifelong Democrat. My parents were lifelong Democrats. Democrats. The Democrats have been a horrible party forever. Their roots in Jefferson were pretty good. And then they were more or less reborn under Jackson, and they weren't so good. And they were the ones who imposed the Jim Crow. They were the KKK. They were all of that. They were the ones who imposed the progressive era on us. Now, Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican, but he left the Republicans because he liked progressivism. And you have to understand that every war of the 20th century was started by Democrats, every single one. Nixon was voted in to get us out of Vietnam. Old Ike, he was voted in because of the Korean War. There finally became a time when the Democrats had fully infiltrated the Republican Party, and then you had things like George Bush and the Gulf War, which was brief. But the interests there are foreign agents, foreign corruption. Let's see, where did I leave off here? Thus, the policy and the will of one country are subjected to the policy and will of another. Saudi Arabia, right? Kuwait, right? How about just about everything? We have 120 military bases around, or we're in 120 countries with military bases around the country because of what? The Cold War? Why do you think that is? Do you really think that we have to do that? Now, there could be an argument that at the time that there was a issue with Russia that we needed to keep communism from coming into the rest of Europe or spreading. Couldn't make that argument. I don't know if that's a good argument. There are many times that we've done things as the United States, like assassinations and the like. Now, I'm not going to read to you all the stuff that Washington said about that, about staying out of foreign affairs. This isn't about, you know, being an isolationist, which, by the way, most Americans approved of up until the Second World War, and still approved of after Korea, and still approved of in Vietnam. They didn't like the war. This isn't about that. Free trade is amazing. It's great. We should do it with every nation. No one calls Switzerland isolationist. They're very rich. They live very good lives. They're very free, actually. No one calls them that. That's propaganda, people. That's what propaganda does. And you think that. And you think that because you've never thought through it. You were just told that and you believe it. It is important, likewise, that the habits of thinking in a free country should inspire caution in those entrusted with its administration to confine themselves within their respective constitutional spheres, avoiding any excess of powers of one department to encroach upon another. What we just do now is we just have a bunch of extra constitutional bureaucracies that make up rules and laws and stuff, and we don't even allow the Congress to do its actual job. Congress doesn't really do much. It just basically passes budgets. It will enact some legislation now and again, but it's usually nothing that big of a deal. But it'll be like things like campaign finance reform to just help entrench the parties even more into themselves. You know, the first 100 years or so of the United States, and a little bit longer than that, we had a constant shift of political parties. And then essentially after the Civil War, that's where the Republicans and the Democrats became very enshrined. I mean, did you realize that? Did you know that? The spirit of encroachment tends to consolidate the powers of all the departments in one, and thus to create whatever the form of government a real despotism. Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. And that's all I have on. I'm going to read to you on that. But I want you to really understand this. You really have to understand this. These men were very wise. They knew which way the country would go. And frankly, I believe they expected Americans to guard their liberty more. But it's what happens. People get comfortable. I'll just defer my own personal responsibility to somebody else. And it happens in people's lives all over the place. I talked the other day. It happens to most people with charity, and it's a disgusting thing. You know, there is no strong society that does not have a strong moral basis. And you can believe in whatever religion you want. I believe I have particular religious beliefs, but I don't push those upon people unless they ask me what they are. I will say this. Most people don't even understand how infiltrated their churches have become. They've become very infiltrated with left-wing propaganda, with communist propaganda, with all kinds of silly, nonsensical ideas that are ahistorical. They don't line up with psychology or biology. There's nothing within their philosophies that line up with any sort of biblical philosophy. And, there are the other people that are the atheist, agnostics, or maybe they're Muslim or Satanist or Buddhist or whatever. But people just don't care. It's like I just show up to church. That's just it. That's about all the effort I put into it, right? Like, I'm not saying me personally, but I'm saying that's just what a lot of people do. Oh, I show up to church. I pray for my dinner. I read my Bible at church or once a week or something. Where is your study? Where is your mind? How do you safeguard your liberty? Well, I say it's through strong education, and it's largely why our education system has been purposely just been destroyed. How else do you safeguard your liberty? Well, you take responsibility for your actions. And how often has the government come in and removed responsibility of people's actions? Or often now we hear about how criminals, for instance, aren't responsible for their actions because of the idea that they can't do any better. Those poor people can't do any better. Well, they can do better. You know, they're not victims of their circumstances. Now, there's some people that may be irredeemable for what they've done, and they just won't turn their hearts away. But they're not victims of their circumstances. They still have free will. And so, unless you don't believe in free will, and that we are just all run by some spirit mind or programs within our body or something of that sort, then why do we even lock people up then? Why do we bother? Why do we bother with any of this? But again, I'm not going to go on. It's been long enough. So I hope you all have a happy weekend. This has been AllMinucOne. Hey, I forgot again, but like, share, subscribe. I'm Bill, and I'll see you all around.